Vito Corleone in the Godfather saga is a fictional character, that's no secret. However, how many people know that he was inspired by real Mafia godfathers active in New York during the 1940s and 50s? Few, I imagine. Yet, it is quite easy to draw parallels between Don Corleone and reality. Take a look. Don Vito's discreet lifestyle in the film to stay under the authorities' radar? It's a nod to the life of Godfather Carlo Gambino. Seeing him achieve a leadership position in the underworld at a young age, and later instructing his son not to follow in the same path, that brings to mind the story of Joseph Bonanno. The olive oil business to cover the family's illegal dealings? It's a reference to the importation business Joe Profaci opened in the 1920s. But what is even more striking is the connection that can be made with another Godfather. A Godfather whom actor Marlon Brando went so far as to imitate by adopting a voice and gestures almost identical.
I can't remember the last time that you invited me to your house for a cup of coffee.
Mr. Halley, all due respect for the sandwich, I have an awful lot of respect for him. I'm not going to answer another question. You just says I'm not under arrest and I'm going to walk out.
A Godfather who, like Don Corleone, had a strong relational influence throughout numerous political contacts. A Godfather who categorically refused his men to get involved in drug trafficking, just like Don Vito, and who ultimately had a life relatively similar to the well-known fictional character today. You've probably guessed who we're talking about. We're talking about the Prime Minister of the Underworld, Frank Costello. Frank Costello earned that nickname because of his many political connections and his preference for peace over war within the underworld. Considered one of the most respected and influenced mobsters in Mafia history, he indeed had a slew of politicians under his thumb, using them to benefit the entire New York underworld. At the time, he alone represented the most powerful political force in New York. In the 1940s and 50s, no one could become a judge, high-ranking official, or even mayor of the city without Frank's approval. His creed was always to avoid troubles. Frank avoided them like the plague, to be honest. So while other gangsters were killing each other in bloody turf wars, he calmly counted his stacks of bills in his luxurious office. In the 1940s, Frank Costello became the new godfather of the Luciano family after his friend Lucky was expelled from the United States. It was his ingenuity, determination, and developed business sense that propelled him to the highest echelons of the Mafia. To achieve this dominant position, one can only imagine the events that transpired. That's why I suggest delving further into the life of this historically overlooked figure. From small independent gangs in New York at the beginning of the 20th century to the windfall that was prohibition in the 1920s, to his ascent in the Cosa Nostra with his associate Lucky Luciano, and through his rivalry with the uncompromising Vito Genovese, you will now know everything about the life of Frank Costello, the Godfather, the real one.
Was a sailor boy from Honolulu town. He just left his sweetheart, he's homeward bound. Handsome Bill is mighty lonesome now for two big eyes of brown.
It's a boy, the sixth child of the Castiglia family. For the parents, Luigi and Maria, it was a rather unexpected event. They did not anticipate that January 26, 1891 would be the day of their new child's birth. Nevertheless, it was good news, and now it was time for the baptism. In full force, the members of the Castellia family headed to the church in their village, located in the Calabria region, Laropoli.
Buon augurio del bambino!
Exclaimed the villagers, wishing good luck to the newborn. Well wishes were met with a timid response from Luigi Castellia. Their family was already very poor, and the arrival of a sixth child, unfortunately, wasn't going to improve their situation. "What name do you want to give the child?" asked the parish priest.
Francesco. Francesco Castellia. The life of the man who would later be called Frank Costello had just begun. Around 1893, the Castellia family had split into two. Don Luigi decided to go to America in hopes of escaping the poverty of the Italian countryside. The meager resources at his disposal didn't allow him to take his entire family with him, so he was forced to leave his wife, two of his daughters, and his son Francesco in Calabria. Don Luigi was certain that he would earn more money in America and that the rest of his family would join him soon. For him, it was just a matter of time. However, the disappointment would be significant. Upon arriving in America, he struggled to save money. Life there turned out to be just as tough as in the Calabrian countryside.
Sell everything, even the bed sheets if necessary, even if you have to borrow some lire from someone, but come to America,
he told his wife. So, after 2 years had passed, the last tickets were purchased. The rest of the family could finally join the United States. In 1895, Francesco Castellia set off for the New World. He would later recall this moment.
It was just the three of us, my mother, my sister, and me. All we took with us from the old country was this huge iron pot my mother liked to cook in. They just fixed up the pot like a bed by lining it with a blanket. And that's where I slept for the entire crossing.
In America, the Castellia family settled into a precarious apartment in the Italian ghetto of East Harlem in New York. They didn't feel too out of place, as the lively neighborhood they lived in was predominantly composed of people from Calabria. Over there, everyone spoke Italian. To provide for his family, Luigi Castellia opened a grocery store on 108th Street. However, the business brought in little income, just enough to cover housing and food, despite the help from Maria and the children. The offspring, growing quickly, never had enough to satisfy their hunger. Life was tough. At dinner, Francesco never failed to compare the contents of his plate with those of his siblings to ensure he received his fair share. One of his friends would later recount. When you dined regularly with Frank, you quickly learned not to touch the contents of his plate. There was no question of tasting what he had ordered, as is often done among friends. For Frank, that was a cardinal sin. If someone engaged in such a practice, he would push his plate aside and not touch it anymore. You only need to look at him to understand that he was absolutely furious. He would immediately summon the waiter and order 2 additional portions, one for the person who had dared to nibble from his plate, and the second for himself. It wasn't a fear of germs. He simply detested others eating from his plate. I think this phobia traced back to his impoverished childhood. At the age of 9, Francesco began attending school. It was during this period that his name first appeared in its English form. For young Frank, learning the language of Shakespeare was a challenge. In general, it seems that school is not his forte.
He despises attending classes and prefers roaming the streets. At least outside, he can earn a bit of money. His older brother Eduardo teaches him how to improve his lifestyle by stealing some fruits from the local merchants. This enables Frank to gradually but steadily tread the path of delinquency. Naturally, his parents did not appreciate this at all.
Go to school, my son.
I go to school, Father. I go to school every day.
Francesco, I don't like the friends you have. They are no good and will amount to nothing.
I will amount to something, Mama. Something better than spending my life in a grocery store.
Don't talk that way. You must have respect for your father. Respect.
Yes, Mama.
Frank would loathe and disdain his father throughout his life. The reason was that he regarded him as too soft, too humble, and content with his lot. In fact, he simply couldn't comprehend why his father had accepted such a poor and mediocre life. Frank permanently leaves school at the age of 13. From now on, he seamlessly blends into the petty delinquency of his neighborhood. The school of crime is where Frank had chosen to educate himself. A school that, in the early 20th century, would shape some of the greatest gangsters in the history of the United States. Frank was about to become a part of it. Before the 1920s in New York, gangsters did not mix and generally stuck to their own kind. The Irish had the West Side, while the Italians and Jews controlled the East Side. In East Harlem, the neighborhood where Frank Costello lives, a Sicilian mob boss named Ignazio Lupo dominated the area in the early 1900s. Lupo the Wolf, as he is nicknamed, had indeed managed to gain control of the city by merging his organization with Giuseppe Morello's family. The Sicilian Cosa Nostra, of which he is a part, clearly dominates the New York underworld during this period. Other organizations such as the Neapolitan Camorra or the Calabrian 'Ndrangheta also have some form of influence. But it is the Sicilians who reign over the underground world. Originally, the Mafia was a secret society created by Sicilians for Sicilians. Protecting their people from the misdeeds perpetrated by numerous invaders was what it had done throughout its history, eventually becoming a true state within a state. The catch is that, once imported to the United States, the Mafia bosses decided to forget what had been the very essence of their organization and began extorting their fellow Italians. Ignazio Lupo was one of these racketeers. His men would knock on the doors of merchants, demanding a payment of a tax in exchange for protection. And if you were the merchant, you had better pay the tax. Or they would beat you mercilessly. And if that wasn't enough, well, they would simply burn down your shop. But before they harmed you, the Mafia generally warned you by sending a letter marked with a black hand, the emblem of their extortion method, a sinister seal that terrified all those unlucky enough to receive it. These extortion gangs, known as the Black Hand, were not as organized as the modern Mafia that would emerge in the 1930s. Their organization lacked a formally structured code of conduct and a true hierarchy. However, there was one rule that everyone scrupulously respected: omerta, the law of silence. Frank Costello, who continues his apprenticeship in the streets of East Harlem during this time, conscientiously adheres to it. He had clearly observed that in his neighborhood, informants were not well received. Spilling the beans at a police station equated to being scorned in the streets, and in worse cases, it simply meant signing one's death warrant. Frank had understood this well, so much so that he would not betray a single person in his life. In 1910, Ignazio Lupo and Giuseppe Morello were arrested and sent to prison for counterfeiting. These arrests paved the way for another crime boss to take the lead. This time, it wasn't a Sicilian boss, but a Neapolitan affiliated with the Camorra, Giosuè Gallucci. After the decline in the influence of the Morello family, Gallucci indeed seized power in East Harlem. He was known as a prosperous businessman, acquiring wealth through extortion, the underground lottery, and his significant influence in the democratic political apparatus, providing him with quasi-immunity against law enforcement. It's not possible that Frank may have drawn inspiration from Gallucci, given the path he would later take in organized crime. Nevertheless, Gallucci's reign came to a sudden end on the night of May 17, 1915. 5 gangsters from a rival Neapolitan gang decided that night to kill him and his son in a cafe. Yes, even surrounded by well-connected friends, a crime boss could be taken down. It was a lesson that probably didn't escape Frank at that moment. The old adage that it was better to keep trusted friends close and enemies even closer made perfect sense.
Why don't you go to work?
That day, Don Luigi Castiglia is pondering. His son had been seen by neighbors hanging around the streets all day. Strangely, this time, Frank decides to listen. He goes in search of a job as his father had advised and lands one with a piano delivery man. But it doesn't even last a year. The work is too strenuous and poorly paid. For Frank, the choice is quickly made. He'd rather endure his father's anger than work 12 hours a day for pittance. The allure of the street proves too strong, and Frank returns to less than Catholic activities such as pickpocketing and burglary. Then, one day, he is caught red-handed by a patrolling police officer, when suddenly, a city councilor, recognizing him, intervenes.
I'll take care of that little doggo.
The officer, not bothering, leaves it to the politician to deal with Frank.
I've just done you a favor. Now remember that when I need a favor.
Frank is stunned. Why had this man done him this favor by releasing him from the hands of the police? Finally, he grasps it. He had just understood the importance of doing favors for others. It was a bit like depositing money in the bank. You could withdraw from the account when you needed it, and the bigger it was, the more comfortable you were. It's a lesson he won't fail to put into practice, later developing one of the biggest influence trafficking operations in the history of organized crime in America. It's during this period that Frank Castiglia changes his name. Henceforth, he goes by Frank Costello. Why Costello? The exact reason is not clear. Perhaps he changed it to prevent the police from tracing it back to his parents. Or maybe it was better to integrate into society. Costello, surprisingly, is an Irish surname. There might be another reason. According to the memoirs of Charlie Lucania, better known as Lucky Luciano, an Italian immigrant who, like Frank, was making a name for himself on the streets of the East Side, there are different versions of how the two met. According to one, they became acquainted in the early 1920s. However, another version, told by Lucky Luciano himself, claims they met a few years earlier.
It happened at a movie theater in Times Square. It was a Saturday night, and some of my guys and me went uptown to see what the action was. We liked to go to the movies because them silent pictures had titles and they helped us learn English. Of course, we always sat in the balcony. It was cheaper, and besides, we could throw stuff down on the people in the orchestra and raise all kinds of hell. This particular night, the manager threw us out, and at the same time, he threw out some other guys who were sitting on the other side of the balcony. One of the guys was a little bit older than us, and he had an outfit called the 104th Street Gang. We got together, and it turned out that this older guy was not from Sicily. His name was Francesco Castiglia. Later on, though, he got famous under the name of Frank Costello. The first time I heard him talk, I had to lean over to hear him, cause his voice was very husky. A lot of Italian kids talk like that. Their mothers wanted the best for them, and they thought the best was to get their tonsils and adenoids out the first time the kid's nose started to run. A lot of times, the doctor wasn't so good, and the kid always talked like he had a permanent sore throat after that. That's what happened to Frank.
Frank Costello and Lucky Luciano would later become very good friends. Both young men aspired to the same ambitions in life. They were both insightful, resourceful, and willing to do whatever it took to carve out a place for themselves in the underworld. Later on, they would meet 2 other gangsters, 2 Jews, also hailing from the East Side, Meyer Lansky, a small and cunning tough guy, and Benjamin Siegel, nicknamed Benny or Bugsy, a tall, handsome guy whose appearance could be deceiving because he had an itchy trigger finger. The 4 of them formed a gang,
an association Luciano fondly recalls.
We was the best team that ever got put together. We knew our jobs better than any other guys on the street. We was like the 4 horsemen of Notre Dame, except what would 2 Jewish guys be doing in Notre Dame?
So, to return to the other possible reason for choosing the name Costello, Lucky Luciano recounts this anecdote in which the newly formed group carries out its first heist.
We was gonna break into a riverfront warehouse. Benny was gonna lead the way and take out the night watchman. When we was planning our move, Meyer sort of objected.
Why should the Jews, Bugsy and me, always go first and take all the chances? Then everything gets split down the middle? After all, we've got 2 Italians. Why don't you guys take the same chances?
What do you mean 2 Italians? We're 1 Wop, 1 Mick and 2 Jews, just like in the neighborhood. Lansky stared at me like I was nuts.
What are you talking about, 1 Wop and 1 Mick? Where's the Mick?
I started to laugh, and I pointed to Frank. Him. He's Irish, you know, Frank Costello. That's how Costello got his name. I remember we told this story so many times later on that lots of guys would sometimes call Costello, "Hey Irish." And of course, when we got up to our ears in New York politics, it didn't hurt at all that we had an Italian guy with us with an Irish name like Costello.
To play with fire is to eventually get burned, and Frank Costello was about to face the justice system sooner or later. His first arrest occurred on April 25, 1908. Frank, accompanied by 2 other young thugs, was arrested in the Bronx after beating up and robbing a coal merchant. In front of the judge, he pleaded not guilty and was granted a dismissal. For this first one, let's say he got lucky. Then there was another on October 16, 1912, on 108th Street, this time for armed robbery. Frank, again, with 2 acquaintances, stole nearly $3,600 in cash and $220 worth of jewelry from a housewife. On the day of judgment, he pleaded not guilty again and miraculously escaped with a dismissal. Perhaps he had threatened the plaintiff to drop the charges? No one knows. But then he committed 1 offense too many. The arrest took place in Manhattan on March 2, 1915, just a few months after Frank married a lovely brunette. By that time, Frank had made it a habit not to go out without his revolver. Unfortunately, on that day, he was arrested for carrying a concealed weapon. Initially, he told investigators his name was Frank Saverio, a reference to his mother's maiden name, but eventually claimed his real name was Stello. Clearly an attempt to confuse the authorities and prevent them from discovering his true identity. However, Frank realized that this time it wouldn't be as easy to get away with it. Pleading not guilty wouldn't result in a dismissal, and the bail for temporary release was too high. With no other option, he had to accept it. He would have to languish behind bars before his trial. As time passed, the weight of prison gradually took its toll on him. Well, it was decided he would plead guilty.
Now, Saverio, what is your real name?
Stello.
I find that in 1908, that is 7 years ago, he was arrested for assault and robbery, and in that case, he was discharged. I find that in 1912, he was again arrested for assault and robbery, and he was discharged in that case. In those cases, he gave the name Frank Costello. In this case, he gives his name as Frank Saverio, and I have looked him up, and I find that, while there are a good many letters in regard to him, nevertheless, I find his reputation is not good. On the contrary, it is bad.
Will Your Honor give me another chance?
You have had chances for the last 6 years, and those chances have to cease sometime.
Your Honor, I took the plea just because I was in prison for 1 month and wanted to avoid trouble. I was a married man, but the revolver wasn't found on me. It was found 100 feet away from me.
That is right, and they saw you throw it there. The officers followed you and saw you throw the gun away, and they first captured you and then took you back and got the gun. In other words, your actions were those of a guilty man in every particular. I sentence you to the penitentiary for 1 year. The law says 7 years in state prison.
Frank served 11 out of the 12 months, his good behavior earning him a reduction in sentence. Released in April 1916, he then returned to wandering the streets of East Harlem. While in prison, he had thought long and hard about his future. He was determined not to end up back behind bars, running through the streets with a firearm, and the prospect of going back to prison, or worse, losing his life, was not part of his plans.
That's when I realized I was stupid. Carrying a gun was like carrying a label that said, "I'm dangerous, I'm a criminal, get me off the street." I made up my mind I would never pack a gun again, and I never did.
Clearly, Costello needed a break away from petty crime. What he needed was serious business opportunities. At that moment, the most beautiful gift a small-time gangster like him could dream of arrived to change his criminal dimension, a major event that would soon transform his life and the lives of many other delinquents in the working-class neighborhoods of New York. Prohibition.
Handsome Billy couldn't stand it long. He packed his little grip, left his friends and started to board a ship. Handsome Billy said before he went, "Just take this little tip."
When I'm not built that way, I may promise, but it's 2 to 1. Before the week is out, I'll stray. But frankness is due to one who craves my every kiss. So I make it plain in my refrain that the best I can do is this.
January 16, 1920, midnight. The 18th Amendment to the United States Constitution, ratified a year earlier, comes into effect. It is now illegal to manufacture, transport, import, export, or sell alcoholic beverages. Prohibition had been inaugurated that night. A new era was about to begin in America, an era of fantastic disorder where the law would be constantly flouted. Years of prohibition that would turn out to be lucrative for a number of gangsters seeking prosperity. Like Frank Costello and his associates, determined to seize the great opportunity that lay before them. When prohibition begins, Costello, Luciano, Lansky, and Siegel are determined to play a significant role in this new market. Ambitious they are, there's no doubt. In fact, what they lack at the moment is experience. The four are barely adults and know that it will be challenging to compete with the bigwigs of the Italian mob in New York. Among these bigwigs were Joe Masseria and Ciro Terranova, old school Sicilians with a deep distrust of all non-Italians, especially non-Sicilians. This perspective was completely opposed to the new generation of gangsters like Costello, Luciano, or Lansky, who saw racketeering as strictly a business affair, where origin was not a prerequisite for doing business, collaboration instead of bloodshed. And anyway, there was no time to waste. Prohibition was here, and Americans were eager for their thirst to be quenched. Their entry into the clandestine alcohol market begins with a young man as ambitious as they are, a guy who was a master of burglary and had joined the gang some time ago, Joe Adonis.
Joe Adonis, fresh in the gang, is in Little Italy enjoying an ice cream with Charlie Lucky Luciano when he makes him this proposition.
Charlie, I know we never done no business together, and I never need to ask a favor. But I need 10 grand to make a whiskey buy down in Philly, and I'll cut you in for half.
The day before, Adonis had indeed met Waxy Gordon, a bootlegger from Philadelphia. Waxy had offered him a shipment of guaranteed authentic Scottish whiskey, but Adonis didn't have enough funds to seal the deal. That's why he turned to Lucky Luciano, who recalls.
I put my arm around Adonis's shoulder and I told him to keep his money, that he just found himself a partner who put up all the dough. I called Costello, Lansky, and Siegel, and we got together an hour later. The four of us put up 35 grand in cash, and early the next morning, Adonis and I headed out.
Luciano and Adonis met Waxy Gordon, and the deal was sealed, the first of many business ventures. Luciano himself recounts the beginning of their involvement in the alcohol trade.
The profits were far greater than could ever have been realized by crimes against innocent persons and their property, and the penalties were far less, and the chances of ever paying those penalties almost minute. Protection could be purchased at all levels. Ever since we was kids, we always knew that people could be bought. It was only a question of who did the buying and for how much. After all, we saw it everywhere around us, from the cop on the beat to the captain of the police precinct, from the ward healer to some top politicians. We knew that most of them guys had their hands out. It was Frank Costello, a little bit later, who really opened the door to the whole business of buying influence and protection. He had the style and the class of a guy twice his age, and with that Irish-Italian name we hung on him, he was able to move into all circles. That's when we set up a private bank, not a real bank. We called it our buy money bank. It started with 5 grand and the pot was turned over to Costello to use any way he saw fit. When we made that first buy down in Philly, we almost hit the big time at the very beginning, like we started at the top and kept going up from there. Of course, like in any big business, we had to take care of the guys that could help us, so we greased the police and the politicians. It was all part of the overhead, just like any other business.
So, thanks to Frank Costello, the gang had an entire network of politicians and cops on their payroll throughout Manhattan. This meant they could trade booze in peace, and there was plenty to go around. In addition to his activities with Luciano, Lansky, and Siegel, Costello also partnered with one of the biggest alcohol traffickers during Prohibition, William Vincent Dwyer, an Irish gangster known as Big Bill. And he wasn't called that because of his imposing physique, but due to his hefty bank account and significant political influence. Dwyer and Costello joined forces in 1923. At that time, Dwyer, already well established in alcohol trafficking, reportedly received a proposition from Costello that guaranteed him complete protection against increasingly frequent raiders. For a bootlegger, enduring such attacks meant losing a lot of money, so William Dwyer likely had no other choice but to accept Frank's proposal, risking major trouble otherwise. The Costello-Dwyer partnership became one of the most effective and lucrative in Prohibition history. Every year, they imported an average of $40 million worth of alcohol. They were the only bootleggers during Prohibition who never lost a single truck. As money flowed in more and more, Frank started to gradually change his criminal dimension. Prohibition made him wealthy, more than just a bit, allowing him to invest in other ventures, like real estate. The uncompromising businessman he was, he watched every dollar invested. This success opened the doors to high society for him. In this world, Frank felt like a fish in water. He was friendly, naturally gained trust, and had the appearance of someone not remotely threatening. These qualities allowed him to mingle with whoever he pleased without arousing suspicion. Frank then used this apparent credibility to expand his influence and contacts among high-profile individuals. He got acquainted with politicians, judges, journalists, city councilors, and even movie stars. He corrupted all these people, and in return, they protected his and his associates' underworld businesses. Were you a Prohibition-era alcohol smuggler with a problem? Go see Frank Costello, and he'd solve it in a snap.
Costello always had a fondness for Jews. According to him, they and Italians had a lot in common as newcomers to America. While both communities lived distinctively in Manhattan's ghettos, they had experienced similar struggles. When it came to partnering with them for business, Costello had no issue. He had already partnered with some of them like Lansky or Siegel. In fact, he was about to introduce another into Luciano's gang, a certain Arthur Flegenheimer, better known as Dutch Schultz, a gangster who ruled the underground alcohol market in the Bronx. But this arrival wasn't well received by another member of the gang, a gangster we haven't talked about yet, Vito Genovese. Vito Genovese, a Neapolitan gangster recruited into the gang some time ago, wasn't very popular within the group, especially with Luciano and Costello. However, he had the merit of being good for business, in addition to being a ruthless guy, despite his small stature. One day, Luciano gathers his associates to discuss the political affiliation with Dutch Schultz. Costello, Vito Genovese, Lansky, and Siegel are present. The meeting begins, and when Frank Costello decides to address the topic that brought them all together, Vito starts yelling. Luciano vividly remembers the scene.
What the hell is this? What are you trying to do? Load us up with a bunch of Hebes?
Before Benny or Meyer could even open their mouths, Frank almost swung on him, and he said, very quiet,
Take it easy, Don Fitone. You're nothing but a fucking foreigner yourself.
Whenever anybody wanted to rub Vito's nose in it, they'd call him Don Vitone to his face, or behind his back. And Vito never forgave Frank for reminding him that he wasn't a Sicilian and couldn't ever really belong. That prick Vito had a memory like an elephant and the patience of a lizard, and he waited 35 years for a chance to blast Frank's head off.
The rivalry between Frank Costello and Vito Genovese was just beginning. During Prohibition, the alcohol trade in New York was dominated by Italians, largely thanks to Costello, who, through his contacts, played the perfect intermediary between the legitimate world and the underworld. The supreme leader of the Italian gangs was then a stout and short Sicilian mobster named Giuseppe Masseria, nicknamed Joe the Boss. He had secured this uncontested leadership position in 1922 after eliminating his main competitor outside a cafe. It is said that Lucky Luciano took care of the job that day. Luciano, at the time, was with Vito Genovese, one of Masseria's lieutenants. But Luciano and Genovese were not the only ones working for Joe the Boss. There were also their closest Italian associates, like Frank, who joined the Mafia organization in the 1920s. As the head of the New York underworld, Masseria could thus take a share of what Costello earned. For Frank, this posed no problems. He respected the hierarchy and had no ambition to become a second Joe the Boss. His highly influential position in the outside world was more than enough for him. This suited everyone, including Masseria, who was happy not to have a potential rival intending to take his place. In the early 1920s, Joe Masseria thought he was well established as the boss of bosses in the Sicilian underworld. It was hard to imagine anyone displacing him at that time. Well, maybe there was one person capable of doing so. Yes, that Sicilian immigrant who had just set foot in New York, Salvatore Maranzano. Maranzano, an old-school Sicilian gangster, came to America in the 1920s to taste the American dream for himself. Settled in Brooklyn, he decided to carve out a place in the bootlegging market. To achieve this, he formed a group of Sicilians that gradually began to compete with the already established bosses. As ambitious as he was, Maranzano wanted to incorporate Luciano's gang into his organization. Maranzano saw that Luciano and his associates were running a very prosperous business in the illegal alcohol market. He wanted to recruit them and organized a meeting. Frank Costello and Lucky Luciano attended with the aim of discussing a potential association. The meeting took place before the two joined Masseria's organization.
As things now stand, we're interfering with each other. We're competing for the same whiskey markets and unfortunately killing each other's people. This should come to a stop. Listen, you didn't bring me down here to recite the Bible of what's right and wrong, Maranzano. What have you got on your mind? I would like you to join the great Maranzano family. You would be like my son, like a favorite son. I'm prepared to be very generous. You will be like my own Bambino.
Bambino? Maranzano might have been a bit too condescending towards Luciano.
What right did that prick have to try and take the place of my old man? It was one thing to make a deal and something else to play papa with me.
Maranzano then goes on to elaborate on his proposal. He wishes for Luciano to become the first lieutenant of his family. This way, Luciano would control the entire illegal alcohol market for Maranzano's organization. Costello and the other Italian associates of Luciano would be welcome, but not the Jews such as Lansky or Siegel. Maranzano had thus concluded presenting his proposition. Costello, who hadn't uttered a word since the beginning of the meeting, decides to speak at this moment.
You're talking like we're on top of a Sicilian mountain, Maranzano. Let's get down to the ground. What do you want?
The young are always in such a hurry.
Maranzano goes into more detail this time, fully intent on persuading his two guests, putting all his efforts into it. Luciano recalls the scene.
All during his speech, he was walking around the room. When he finished, he turned to us like he was expecting us to applaud him, like he was wearing a toga and just finished one of them big orations in the Roman Senate. That's the way he always made me feel, like he was Caesar and I was shit. Frank and I just sat there and we didn't say nothing.
After realizing that he wouldn't receive an immediate response, Maranzano advises them to take their time discussing the proposition with their associates. But as you know, history eventually led Luciano and his friends to join Massaria's gang. (1929) is a significant year in the history of the underworld. During May 13th to the 16th of that year, the first organized crime summit takes place. The idea for organizing this conference came from Johnny Torrio, the former head of the Chicago Mafia, who was Al Capone's mentor. Torrio aimed to establish a national crime syndicate, a kind of confederation where all American criminal organizations would be united. He envisioned dividing the United States into slices so that each criminal group would be allocated its fair share. Within this national crime syndicate, everyone would be welcome, not only Italian-American mobsters, but also Jewish and Irish gangsters, as well as African-American criminals. This convention aimed to lay the foundations for a new, more modern mafia, a visionary project that captivates Costello, Luciano, and Lansky, who share Torrio's vision. They decide to help organize this conference. The location is chosen, Atlantic City. Frank Costello takes charge of the invitations. Thus, the New York delegation, the largest at the meeting, arrives in Atlantic City, including Johnny Torrio, Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, Joe Adonis, Vito Genovese, and Dutch Schultz. The New Jersey delegation includes Willie Moretti and Long Ease Willman. Chicago is represented by Al Scarface Capone, Frank Nitti, and Jay Guzik. Philadelphia brings Waxy Gordon, Dig Rosen, and Max Boo Boo Hoff. Not to forget the delegations from Cleveland, Detroit, Boston, Kansas City, Louisiana, Florida, and the host of the convention and Atlantic City boss, Enoch Nucky Johnson. In short, the biggest names in the underworld are present, all except Maranzano and Masseria, as they were not invited. Their traditional views, particularly working only with Italian gangs, did not align with the modern ideals and principles of Torrio, Luciano, Costello, and Lansky. According to some FBI informants, Frank Costello was the mastermind behind the conference. The conference had several objectives, one of which was to lay the groundwork for the National Crime Syndicate. Another objective was to address the violence problems plaguing Chicago at the time. It was only a few months after the St. Valentine's Day massacre, where Al Capone orchestrated the killing of 7 gangsters in a struggle related to the illegal alcohol market, an event that had drawn significant attention from the media, which was undoubtedly bad for business. Johnny Torrio starts discussing this issue, stating that all conflicts must now cease. Costello is then introduced and takes control of the meeting.
The reason we got to organize is that we got to put ourselves on a business basis. That is what we are in, a business. We got to stop the kind of things that's going on in Chicago right now. You guys are shooting at each in the street, and innocent people are getting killed, and they're starting to squawk. If they squawk loud enough, the feds get off their tails and start cracking down. And you know what that means.
Certainly audacious on Costello's part, it's undeniable that Capone must have felt targeted at that moment. Knowing Capone's fiery temperament, it took courage to challenge his behavior. Costello then unveils a plan to put an end to the bloodshed. Torrio takes the floor to announce it.
To jail. We have to smooth this thing over right now. You have to go back to Chicago after that Valentine Day shootout, and O'Banion boys will be at war. The heat will go higher. We think you need a vacation, Al.
At this point, Capone thinks it's a joke, but Costello quickly reminds him that no one is there to joke.
This ain't a joke, Al. We got too much invested for you to ruin the gravy train. Make it easy on yourself. Think of a way. But we need you off at the college until things cool down.
Seeing the people in the room align with Costello and Torrio's stance, Capone realizes that it's serious. He is angry, but he knows he has no choice. He leaves the meeting, and sometime later, he turns himself into the authorities. 10 months in prison is what he'll take for a charge relating to carrying prohibited weapons. So, the Atlantic City Conference is concluded. It was the first summit of organized crime that gave Frank Costello a national stature in the underworld. His key words during the conference were peace and cooperation, and they were indeed upheld. His colleagues from all corners of the United States had witnessed his diplomatic talents in resolving the Chicago conflict. The era of war should now be in the past. Business is all that should matter. A message that would have been useful to convey to Masseria and Maranzano, the two notable absentees from the conference, because they were on the verge of triggering a new feud. A Mafia war, this time impossible to calm, given the intense tensions. Joe Masseria and Salvatore Maranzano were the two most prominent mob bosses in New York in the late 1920s. The problem was they couldn't stand each other, and that was a bad sign. It had become increasingly apparent that the two leaders would clash for control of the Mafia, and it was just a matter of when the war would break out. Masseria's clan consisted mainly of Sicilian, Calabrian, and Neapolitan gangsters. Among them were Lucky Luciano, Frank Costello, Vito Genovese, Joe Adonis, Willie Moretti, Albert Anastasia, Carlo Gambino, Giuseppe Morello, Gaetano Reina, and Alfred Mineo. Maranzano's organization, on the other hand, was predominantly composed of mobsters from Castellammarese del Golfo, a small Sicilian town about 100 kilometers from Palermo. Maranzano could rely on Joseph Bonanno, Thomas Lucchesi, Stefano Magadino, Joseph Profaci, Joe Aiello, Joseph Magliocco, Tommy Gagliano, Vito Bonventre, and Joseph Velacchi. Tensions began in 1928 when the factions started diverting each other's alcohol trucks. Initially, it was nothing spectacular. Someone got shot here, a truck attacked there. It wasn't until February 1930 that the war truly erupted, sparked by the assassination of Gaetano Reina. Gaetano Reina, an ally of Masseria at the time, decided to switch sides and join the Castellammarese. This betrayal didn't sit well, especially with Joe the Boss, who wasted no time in retaliating. He enlisted one of his lieutenants, Vito Genovese. On the night of February 26, 1930, things took a drastic turn. Reina, leaving his mistress's apartment, walked into an ambush. Vito Genovese, armed with a double-barreled shotgun, fired a shot into Reina's head. With Reina dead, Masseria exacerbated tensions with the opposing camp. The Castellammarese of Maranzano sought revenge, adding fuel to the fire. For the mafioso involved in the conflict, it was time to go to the mattresses, meaning they would bunk down in secret apartments covered only by mattresses, stay in groups, and always be armed to protect themselves from enemy attacks. The conflict between Masseria and Maranzano's men reached its climax. The Castellammarese War, officially underway, grew increasingly violent on the streets of New York. Frank Costello, also an ally of Masseria, managed to stay out of the fights without appearing disloyal. He notably assisted Joe the Boss when the latter miraculously escaped death in a shootout. While fleeing, Joe had dropped his coat, which later led authorities to him. Fortunately, Joe could count on Frank, who, a few days later, went to a Bronx police station to resolve the issue. He conveyed a clear message to the officers. Nobody should lay a finger on Masseria. Helping out was no problem for Costello, but he disapproved of this war. To him, it was unnecessary, and such a conflict could only harm business. Luciano and Genovese thought the same. All these clashes caused by the old Dons had to stop as soon as possible, especially since their boss was about to lose the war. Costello, Luciano, and Genovese tried to convince Masseria to seek peace, but Joe turned a deaf ear. With peace not on the agenda, they had only one option left: conspire against Joe the Boss to definitively end the war. Making a deal with the enemy was the path they would now take. Luciano, Costello, Lansky, and their allies had actually been planning to seize power within the underworld for a long time. They were just waiting for one thing: the right opportunity, which had finally arrived. The old Dons, as they were called, were only preventing them from building the new foundations of organized crime.
All us younger guys hated the old mustaches and what they was doing. We was trying to build a business that'd move with the times, and they was still living 100 years ago. We knew the old guys and the ideas had to go. We was just marking time. The way we looked at it was that getting rid of a Masseria or a Maranzano was no different from some bank tearing down an old building so they could put up a new one. For us, rubbing out a mustache was just like making way for a new building, like we was in the construction business.
The first step was to get rid of Masseria. To do this, Luciano and his associates arranged a secret meeting with Maranzano. At the end of the meeting, both parties agreed that Luciano and his friends would take care of eliminating Masseria, with the assurance that the opposing camp would not launch any purges once Joe the Boss was gone. Maranzano, like them, claimed to desire peace. The Castellammarese War had spilled too much blood, and it was imperative to restore order on the streets of New York. The handshake between Lucky Luciano and Salvatore Maranzano that day marked the death sentence for Masseria. April 15th, 1931. Lucky Luciano is alone with Masseria in one of the old Don's offices. Joe is seated in a chair, listening to what Luciano has to say. Luciano outlines a plan to assassinate an impressive lineup of Maranzano's lieutenants, aiming for a complete victory.
I must have talked for a couple of hours, and old Joe was beaming and laughing like he could just taste Maranzano's blood out of a gold cup.
Noon arrives. Luciano suggests to Joe the Boss to celebrate this imminent victory by going to have lunch.
I could see Masseria's eyes start to shine the minute I mentioned this great food, and when I was making the arrangements over the phone, I swear I could hear the spit drooling out of his mouth, because I ordered enough food to stuff a horse.
Having arrived there, they ordered food, with Masseria ordering more than Lucky, as it takes Joe the Boss nearly 3 hours to finish his meal. Just before 3:30 p.m., Luciano decides to suggest to Masseria to relax by playing cards. They play one round. At the end of the second, Lucky excuses himself, saying he needs to go to the restroom. However, as soon as the restroom door closes, a group of armed men bursts into the restaurant. It was the end for Joe. The multiple bullets lodged in his neck had taken their toll. His death marked the end of the war. A war that had declared his great rival, Salvatore Maranzano, as the winner. Maranzano wastes no time satisfying his thirst for power by organizing a meeting that is supposed to crown him capo di tutti capi, which in the Mafia means the boss of all bosses. All the major New York mobsters were present to witness what was supposed to make Maranzano the supreme leader of the Mafia. A coronation that does not sit well with Luciano, Costello, and the others. They have no intention of letting him get away with it. They know very well that they are not safe now that Maranzano has full control. The idea of making his reign as brief as possible comes to mind. Luciano, Costello, and their associates have decided to plot against the new king. On his side, Maranzano quickly realizes what is happening. He has no intention of letting them get away with it. He then draws up a list of 60 people to be executed and presents it to one of his most loyal lieutenants, Joseph Alecki.
We have to go to the mattress again. We have to get rid of these people.
The list included Frank Costello, Lucky Luciano, Vito Genovese, Joe Adonis, Vincent Mangano, Dutch Schultz, and Al Capone. Capone having supported Masseria by contributing massively to the war chest from Chicago. But Maranzano isn't the only one creating his blacklist. Luciano and his allies also create one, with the difference being that theirs includes all the old-school mafiosi. September 10th, 1931, just before 2 o'clock in the afternoon, 4 men sent by Luciano's gang, disguised as federal agents, enter Maranzano's office. Maranzano hears a commotion, goes out to investigate, and suddenly faces a group of threatening armed men. Maranzano tries to seek refuge in his office, but it's too late. The fake federal agents stab him and then shoot him 4 times. The new Mafia Guard, which included Frank Costello and his associates, had finally succeeded in eliminating the old Dons. They could now organize crime as they saw fit. It was the beginning of a new era, one of renewal and modernity within the Mafia. An extremely prosperous era in which Frank Costello would play a crucial role. The story was just beginning. Don't miss the second and final part of this documentary film. Frank Costello's life is still full of many twists and turns. Coming up next, we will delve into his rise to the top of organized crime, some of his legal troubles, and most importantly, his rival with the ruthless Vito Genovese. To ensure you're notified when this second episode is released, subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell. Thank you for taking the time to watch the first part of my documentary on Frank Costello. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, feel free to show your appreciation by liking and sharing the video. I appreciate your patience in advance. Take care and see you soon.